This is not a fight story. Nobody gets hit. Well, that's not entirely true. A few shots land. But this is not about who landed them. This is about a face. One expression on one face, seen by one person, on an afternoon that nobody wrote down, in a room that no longer exists. I've been researching Bruce Lee for a long time now. Years. And in those years, I've collected hundreds of stories. Fight stories, mostly. Bruce against this challenger, Bruce against that doubter. Big men, strong men, fast men. Men who walked in thinking they knew something and walked out knowing they didn't. Those stories have a shape. A beginning, a middle, and an end that always curves in the same direction. Bruce reads his opponent. Bruce adapts. Bruce wins. The details change. The arc doesn't. But there is one story that has no arc. One afternoon that doesn't curve. It just sits there, flat and strange, like a photograph taken from an angle that shouldn't exist. And the reason I know about it is because of a man who was in the room when it happened. A man who watched it from 8 feet away, sitting with his back against a wall, and who has spent the last 50 years trying to understand what he saw. He's the one who told me this story. Not Bruce. Not the opponent. The witness. And I think his version might be the most important one. Because Bruce's version would be about technique, about problem solving, about the mechanical puzzle of facing something new. The opponent's version, well, we'll get to why that version doesn't exist. But the witness version is about something else entirely. It's about what happens when you watch the person you believe is invincible meet something he can't immediately conquer. It's about the sound a belief makes when it cracks. His name doesn't matter. He asked me not to use it, and I won't. What matters is what he saw over 2 years of training under Bruce Lee before that afternoon, because without those 2 years, the afternoon means nothing. He started training with Bruce in his mid-20s. Came from a traditional martial arts background, had some skill, had some ego, lost both within the first week. Not because Bruce humiliated him. Because Bruce showed him what speed actually looked like when it wasn't being faked. He describes his first day with a sentence I haven't been able to forget. He said, "I thought I knew what fast was. I didn't even know what slow was." Within a month, he understood the hierarchy. Bruce was not at the top of some ladder that other martial artists were also climbing. Bruce was on a different structure entirely. A separate building. With no stairs and no doors and no particular interest in letting anyone else inside. You trained with Bruce, you learned from Bruce, you watched Bruce, but you did not compete with Bruce. That wasn't modesty talking. That was physics. Over 2 years, this man watched Bruce spar more than 50 opponents. Different styles, different sizes, different levels of experience. Some were students. Some were visitors. Some were challengers who had heard the reputation and wanted to test it. A few were genuinely dangerous. Most were not. But all of them shared one thing in common. They were readable. I've spoken to 7 of Bruce's former students from that era. 7 different people, interviewed separately, years apart. All of them described the same thing. They used different words for it, different metaphors, different frames of reference. But they're all pointing at the same phenomenon. Bruce could look at a person, any person, and see their entire system in seconds. Not minutes. Seconds. The observer, our witness, described it to me like this. Imagine you're watching someone play piano. Within a few notes, you can tell if they're classical or jazz. You can tell if they're trained or self-taught. You can tell if they're nervous or confident. The notes tell you everything, even before the song takes shape. Bruce did that with bodies. The way you stood told him how you'd move. The way you breathed told him how long you'd last. The way your shoulders sat told him which hand you favored. The angle of your hips told him whether you were a kicker or a puncher. And once he knew that, and he always knew that, the sparring session was already over. The rest was just demonstration. He told me about a karate black belt who came in one afternoon. Big guy, formal, clearly accomplished in his own right. Third or fourth Dan, the observer thought. The man bowed, assumed his stance, and Bruce tilted his head the way a dog tilts its head when it hears a frequency humans can't detect. 3 seconds. Maybe less. The observer had learned to watch Bruce's eyes during these moments, and he said Bruce's eyes did something like a camera focusing. A tiny adjustment, almost mechanical, and then stillness. Total stillness. That was the tell. When Bruce went still, he'd finished reading. The rest of the sparring lasted about 15 seconds. The Karate Man threw 2 techniques. Bruce was already moving before either one launched. Not reacting. Anticipating. The man left confused but respectful, and Bruce moved on to the next thing like he'd just finished tying his shoes. Then there was a wrestler. College level, thick neck, heavy through the hips, the kind of man who wanted to close distance and make the fight ugly. The observer watched Bruce's eyes do the same thing. The focus. The stillness. The wrestler shot in low, reaching for Bruce's hips, and Bruce wasn't there. Wasn't there in a way that looked choreographed, like a dance step he'd rehearsed 1,000 times. The wrestler shot again. Same result. By the third attempt, the wrestler was breathing hard and Bruce hadn't changed his respiratory rate at all. There was a boxer from a gym in downtown Los Angeles. Fast hands, good footwork, clearly trained by someone who knew what they were doing. This one lasted a little longer, maybe 20 seconds. The boxer threw a jab, and the observer said Bruce moved his head exactly the width of a fist. Not 6 inches. Not a foot. The width of a fist. The precise minimum distance required to make the punch miss. As if he'd measured it. As if he'd calculated the trajectory of a fist he'd never seen before and moved exactly enough to avoid it, and not 1 centimeter more. The boxer threw 3 more punches. Bruce avoided each one with the same economy, the same eerie precision, and then he closed the distance and the boxer was done. 50+ sparring sessions. Different styles, different bodies, different temperaments. Same result. Every single time. Bruce reads. Bruce adapts. Bruce wins. The observer built his worldview on this foundation. Not consciously, not deliberately, the way you don't deliberately decide to believe in gravity. You just drop things and they fall, and after enough repetitions, you stop questioning the mechanism. Bruce Lee could not be beaten. This was not faith. This was data. 2 years of data. Exposed to rigorous and repeated testing. Verified across dozens of independent samples. The conclusion was not emotional. It was empirical. He told me that he stopped being impressed somewhere around month 14. Not because Bruce became less extraordinary, but because extraordinary became normal. When you see a miracle every Tuesday, miracles lose their charge. You start watching Bruce the way you watch a sunset, aware that it's beautiful, unable to feel the full weight of it because beauty at that frequency becomes background noise. That was his state of mind when, on an unremarkable afternoon sometime in the mid-1960s, he can't pin the exact year and I haven't been able to either, a man walked into Bruce Lee's training space who didn't have a system to read. But I need to hold that moment for now. Because to understand what walked through that door, you need to understand where it came from. The man arrived through a chain of introductions so long and so tangled that even the people involved couldn't reconstruct it later. Someone knew someone who knew someone who had trained with someone who had once shared a meal with someone who had connections to Bruce's circle. It took months for the chain to complete itself, and even then, the final link was casual. Almost accidental. The man was in Los Angeles. He had heard about Bruce Lee the way everyone in martial arts had heard about Bruce Lee. Not through newspapers. Not through television, not yet. Through whispers. Through the quiet network of fighters and teachers and students that connected every dojo and kun and gym in the world like an invisible root system beneath a forest. He didn't come with a challenge. That's important. He didn't come with ego or hostility or anything to prove. The word he used, relate through a translator and then through the observer and then through 50 years of memory and then through me, was exchange. He wanted to exchange ideas. which, in the context of martial arts in the 1960s, meant he wanted to spar. But the framing mattered. Exchange implied mutuality. It implied that he had something to offer, not just something to test. The day he arrived, the observer was already at the training space. Sitting in his usual spot, back against the wall, waiting for the afternoon session to begin. Bruce was there, doing what Bruce always did before a session, which was everything and nothing. Moving. Stretching. Shadowboxing. Thinking. Bruce was always thinking. His body was never still, but even when it moved, you could feel the thinking happening underneath, like an engine running beneath a hood. The man walked in, and the observer's first thought was, nothing. Literally nothing. He looked at this man the way you look at someone standing in line at a grocery store. Average height, maybe 5'8". Average build, maybe 155 soaking wet. Average face. Average posture. He was wearing simple clothing, dark pants, a plain shirt. No martial arts uniform, no insignia, no visible indicators of training or lineage. In a room of martial artists, he was furniture. The observer's second thought, following immediately from the first, was this is going to be quick. He'd seen this before. Men who looked like nothing, who had heard the name Bruce Lee and wanted to see for themselves. They came in quiet and respectful and left 5 seconds later, having learned something they couldn't unlearn. This man had that same quiet and that same respect, and the observer assumed the same 5 seconds were coming. Bruce greeted him. Polite, relaxed, warm in the way Bruce could be warm when he sensed no threat and no posturing. They exchanged a few words. The observer couldn't hear all of it from 8 feet away, but the tone was collegial. Two professionals meeting. No tension. No drama. Then the man warmed up. I need to describe this carefully, because the observer described it carefully, and the care in his description told me more than the words themselves. He said the man began moving, and the room changed temperature. Not literally. Emotionally. Something shifted in the atmospheric pressure of the space. The man stretched, and the stretching was wrong. Not wrong as in incorrect. Wrong as in alien. Every martial artist the observer had ever seen moved within a framework. Boxers have a rhythm, a bounce, a way their weight shifts that announces itself like a drumbeat. Karate practitioners are angular, precise, their movements built on straight lines and sharp corners. Wrestlers are heavy, grounded, their center of gravity low and sticky. Wing Chun guys are compact, centered, their arms tracing paths that look like geometry. Everyone has a signature. A pattern. A language their body speaks. This man had no language. His body spoke nothing. Or rather, it spoke a language the observer had never encountered and couldn't parse. Every movement was disconnected from the movement before it. There was no rhythm, no repetition, no underlying structure. He didn't move like a boxer. He didn't move like a karate man. He didn't move like a wrestler or a Wing Chun practitioner or a judoka or a fencer or a street fighter or anything the observer could name. He moved like a man who had studied all of those things and then forgot them deliberately, one by one, until what was left was motion without signature. A body in space, going where it went, with no preceding logic to explain why it went there. The observer tried to read him. Tried to do what he'd watched Bruce do 100 times. Looked at the stance. There was no stance. Looked at the shoulder tension. It changed every second. Looked at the hip angle. It was different each time he looked. The man's body offered no information because there was no pattern to extract information from. It was like trying to read a book printed in an ink that rearranged itself every time you focused on a word. I tried to trace this man. For 3 years, on and off, following leads that started promisingly and ended in silence. The trail goes to Manila, then to Bangkok, then to a handful of unnamed fighting pits and provinces I can't verify, and then it vanishes. Underground fighting in Southeast Asia in the 1950s and 60s didn't keep records. There were no sanctioning bodies, no weigh-ins, no contracts, no medical checks. Men fought. Some won. Some lost. Some died. And the ones who survived long enough to develop reputations either leveraged those reputations into something public, a school, a name, a legacy, or they disappeared back into the noise from which they'd emerged. This man chose disappearance. Or maybe disappearance chose him. The distinction may not matter. What I've been able to piece together is this. He fought in circuits where there were no rules. Not limited rules in the way that early mixed martial arts events had limited rules. No rules. No referee. No weight classes. No time limits. A space, 2 men, and whatever happened next. In environments like that, patterns are a death sentence. If you're a boxer, someone who has fought 30 boxers will read you in a round. If you're a wrestler, someone will sprawl before you shoot because they've seen that shot 1,000 times. The only men who survived those circuits over years, not months but years, were the men who became unreadable. Not through philosophy. Not through training methodology. Through evolution. The same blind, merciless process that strips color from cave-dwelling fish and adds venom to slow-moving creatures. Adaptation to an environment that killed everything predictable. The observer didn't know any of this at the time. He just knew that the man warming up in front of him made his skin feel strange, and that for the first time in 2 years, the 5 seconds he predicted were starting to feel optimistic. His resume was essentially 5'8", 155, and an inability to be categorized, which in the martial arts world of the 1960s was like showing up to a costume party in street clothes. Everyone else was dressed as something. This man was dressed as nothing. And nothing, it turns out, is very hard to fight. Bruce finished his preparation. The man finished his. They faced each other across maybe 10 feet of open floor. The observer settled into his spot against the wall, 8 feet away, close enough to see the sweat forming on both men's foreheads, close enough to hear their breathing, close enough to see the micro-expressions that would tell him, as they always told him, exactly how this would unfold. He knew how it would go. Bruce would read. Bruce would adjust. Bruce would dominate. 15 seconds, maybe 20. Then handshakes, kind words, and the man would leave with a story he'd tell for the rest of his life about the time he sparred Bruce Lee. 4 minutes. That's how long it actually lasted. For minutes that changed the way Bruce Lee understood fighting, and 4 minutes that the observer has been turning over in his mind for half a century like a stone in a tumbler, wearing it smooth but never wearing it away. They began. Bruce approached the way he always approached. Relaxed, centered, balanced. His weight distributed with the precision of an engineer who understood load-bearing structures at a molecular level. His eyes did what they always did, scanned. The observer watched those eyes, as he always did, looking for the familiar sequence. The sweep from feet to knees to hips to shoulders to hands to face. The camera focus moment. The stillness that meant the reading was complete. The sweep happened. Feet. Knees. Hips. Shoulders. Hands. Face. The focus didn't come. Bruce's eyes swept again. Faster this time. The same path, the same checkpoints, but with an urgency the observer had never seen. Like a man rereading a sentence that didn't make grammatical sense. Sure, he'd missed a word. And then the observer saw something on Bruce's face that he had never seen before in 2 years of near-daily observation. A micro-expression. Tiny. If you weren't watching for it, if you hadn't spent 2 years calibrating your attention to the exact frequency of Bruce Lee's facial movements, you would have missed it entirely. It lasted maybe a third of a second. It wasn't confusion, exactly. The observer struggled with this word and ultimately rejected it. Bruce Lee did not get confused. His processing speed was too high for confusion, which requires a gap between input and comprehension, and Bruce's gap was essentially zero. It was more like, and the observer used this metaphor himself, recalibration. As if a system that had never returned an error suddenly displayed one, and the operator, rather than panicking, simply ran the scan again. Calmly. Methodically. But with the undeniable implication that the first scan had failed. Bruce Lee's first scan had never failed. The observer felt something shift in his chest. Not fear. Not yet. Just a vibration, like a tuning fork struck in a frequency he'd never heard. Bruce attacked. A probing jab. Standard opening, one the observer had seen 100 times. Fast, light, extended with that whip-crack speed that made Bruce's hands look like they existed in a different time signature than the rest of the world. The jab was not designed to hurt. It was designed to provoke. A question mark thrown at the opponent's defenses, asking, "What do you do when something comes at you from this angle at this speed?" Every opponent the observer had ever seen answered that question. They blocked, or they dodged, or they flinched, or they countered. Every answer revealed information. The block told you about their training. The dodge told you about their instincts. The flinch told you about their experience level. The counter told you about their confidence. All of it was data, and all of it fed back into the machine of Bruce's comprehension. The man didn't answer the question. He wasn't there. Not because he dodged. Dodging is a response. It requires seeing the incoming strike, processing it, and moving in reaction to it. This man simply was not in the position Bruce had targeted. He had already moved. Not away from the jab, because the jab hadn't been thrown yet when he moved. He had moved because he was always moving. His position at any given moment was temporary, not because he was reacting to stimuli but because he existed in a state of permanent relocation. He was never where he was. He was always becoming somewhere else. The jab hit air. Not close air. Not almost air. The man was simply elsewhere. Like a leaf in moving water, never where the current predicts. I want to be careful here. I'm reconstructing a sparring session from one man's memory, 50 years after the fact. Memory is unreliable. Emotion distorts. Reverence amplifies. I know all of this. I've studied enough eyewitness testimony to know that the human brain is less a recording device and more a storytelling engine, one that rewrites its own archives every time they're accessed. But here's the thing, the details this man gave me were not the details of exaggeration. They were not dramatic. They were not cinematic. They were small, granular, mechanical. The kind of details a man remembers when he has replayed a single afternoon so many times that it's worn grooves into his brain, the way a river wears grooves into rock. Not through force. Through repetition. Bruce recalibrated. Changed angle. Moved to the man's left, adjusting his approach vector the way a pilot adjusts for crosswind. Attacked again. Faster this time, more committed. Not a probe anymore. A real technique, thrown with real intention and real speed. Same result. The man was not where Bruce expected. But, and this is the part that made the observer's palms go cold, he hadn't moved in a predictable direction. When a boxer dodges, he goes back or he goes sideways. When a karate practitioner evades, he angles off at 45 degrees. When a wrestler ducks, he drops level. Every style has its escape routes, and every escape route is a corridor that the attacker can learn to patrol. You dodge left twice, and the third time, I'll be waiting on your left. That's how reading works. That's how prediction works. That's how Bruce Lee dismantled people, by mapping their corridors and stationing himself at the exits. This man had no corridors. He moved in a direction that made no martial arts sense. Not back. Not sideways. Not at an angle that any system teaches. He moved in a direction that existed outside the taxonomy of martial movement, a direction that no style had considered because no style had needed to consider it, because no one had ever gone there before. It was like watching a chess piece move in a direction not on the board. Bruce tried again. Different technique. Different timing. Different angle. Same result. The man was not there. Was not anywhere Bruce aimed. Was not operating on the same grid. The observer's stomach dropped. He used that exact phrase. My stomach dropped. And then he said something that I've been thinking about ever since. He said, "You have to understand, I had never seen Bruce miss. Not once. not a single time in 2 years. Bruce Lee didn't miss. His accuracy was one of those things that you stopped questioning, like the sun coming up. It was a fact of the universe. And now I was watching him miss 3 times in a row. And the thing he was missing wasn't faster than him. Wasn't bigger, wasn't stronger. It was just not there. 4 minutes. Remember that number. Fighters in those underground Southeast Asian pits sometimes finished each other in less time than it takes to exhale. Bruce himself had ended sparring sessions in single-digit seconds. 4 minutes in that room, between those two men, was an eternity. A geological age. 90 seconds in, the man attacked for the first time. And the word the observer used was casual. Not aggressive, not explosive, not fast in any way that would register as impressive on camera. Casual. A strike from an angle that Bruce hadn't been covering, thrown with the ease of a man reaching for a glass of water on a table he knows well. It didn't land clean. Bruce's reflexes were too deeply wired, too fast, too autonomous for that. His body moved before his mind caught up, and the strike grazed rather than connected. But it almost landed. Almost. In 2 years of watching Bruce spar, nothing had almost landed. Things either missed entirely, which was most things, or they were intercepted and redirected before they became threats. The space between miss and almost was, in the observer's experience, a space that did not exist. And yet here it was. Existing. A few more exchanges followed. Quick, probing, mutual. Contact was made on both sides. Minor contact, nothing damaging, the kind of glancing touch that wouldn't leave a bruise or tell a story. But the fact that any contact at all was reaching Bruce was, to the observer, like watching water flow uphill. It violated the rules. Not the rules of martial arts. The rules of his universe. The final phase of the sparring settled into something the observer had no framework for. Neither man dominated. Neither man retreated. Neither man read the other. They moved around each other like two weather systems of equal pressure, neither one able to push the other, neither one willing to be pushed. It was not a fight. It was not even, in any traditional sense, a sparring session. It was a conversation in a language that neither man spoke fluently, conducted through touch and distance and angle, and the grammar was being invented in real time. The observer watched Bruce's face during this phase, and what he saw there was the thing he's been carrying for 50 years. He described it to me 3 times, in 3 separate conversations, and each time the description was slightly different in its words but identical in its core. The first time he said, "I'd never seen that expression." It wasn't frustration. It wasn't anger. It wasn't fear. It was fascination. Like he was seeing a color he'd never seen before. Not upset that it existed. Thrilled. The second time he said, "You know how a child looks when you show them something they don't understand but want to? That wonder. That pull. Bruce had that. A grown man. The most skilled martial artist alive, looking at another man the way a child looks at a magic trick." The third time he said simply, Bruce was happy. He was happy that he couldn't read this man. I didn't understand that then. I do now. 4 minutes ended. Not with a bang. Not with a decisive strike, a knockdown, a submission, a clear victory by either man. They simply stopped. As if a timer had gone off that only they could hear. As if the conversation had reached a natural pause, the kind where both speakers know that more could be said but enough has been said for now. They bowed to each other. Not the perfunctory bow of formality. Not the deep bow of defeat. A bow of equal depth from equal height. The man nodded to Bruce. Bruce nodded back. And in that exchange of nods, the observer saw something that terrified and illuminated him in equal measure. It was the nod of recognition. 2 people seeing each other clearly for the first time. Not as master and student. Not as winner and loser. As equals who had found each other across an ocean of lesser encounters. The room went quiet. But that's not the right word, because the room had been quiet the entire time. Nobody was cheering. Nobody was counting. Nobody was narrating or commenting or reacting. The few other people present had stopped moving, stopped breathing, stopped existing as anything other than eyes. So the silence that followed the sparring was not new silence. It was a deepening of existing silence. A silence that went from shallow to bottomless in the space between the last movement and the first breath after. It wasn't the silence of defeat. It wasn't the silence of victory. It was the silence of recognition. And if you've never heard that kind of silence, I hope you do someday. Because there is nothing else like it. 4 minutes. 240 seconds. In a career built on finishing encounters before most people could register they had begun, 4 minutes of equilibrium. 4 minutes of draw. 4 minutes that, depending on how you looked at it, were either the most significant or the most insignificant event in Bruce Lee's martial arts life. No winner. No loser. No story, in the traditional sense. Just two men discovering that the other one existed, and that the discovery changed everything. The sparring session ended, and the world moved on. The few people in the room began breathing again, began shifting their weight, began returning to the ordinary rhythms of ordinary existence. Bruce shook the man's hand. They exchanged a few words the observer couldn't hear. The man collected his things, which were few: a bag, a jacket, the portable possessions of a man accustomed to moving through the world lightly. He walked to the door. He walked through it. He did not come back. The observer sat against the wall for a long time after everyone else had left. He didn't know how long. Minutes, maybe. Or longer. Time had become unreliable. He was trying to do something that felt urgent but impossible. He was trying to locate the moment in those 4 minutes when Bruce had won. Because Bruce had won. Surely Bruce had won. In 2 years of empirical observation, Bruce always won, and therefore Bruce had won today, and the observer had simply missed the decisive moment because it was too fast, too subtle, too sophisticated for his untrained eyes to catch. He replayed the 4 minutes. All of them. In order. The first jab that hit nothing. The second attack that hit nothing. The third. The first time the man attacked. The almost. The contact that went both ways. The final phase of mutual incomprehension. The bows. The nods. There was no moment. There was no victory. Not Bruce's. Not the man's. The thing the observer had witnessed was something his belief system had no category for, and so his belief system was trying to file it under victory, Bruce Lee, because that was the only folder that existed, and the document didn't fit. He went home. He didn't sleep. Not because of adrenaline or excitement or any of the usual reasons people don't sleep after witnessing something extraordinary. He didn't sleep because every time he closed his eyes, he saw that micro-expression on Bruce's face. The one that lasted a third of a second, the recalibration, and the sight of it made his chest feel hollow. He described the feeling to me once, and it's the most honest thing anyone has ever said to me about Bruce Lee. He said, "It's like finding out your father is human. You always knew it intellectually. But seeing it, seeing the proof, is different. It changes you. Not because your father becomes less. Because you become more. You have to be more, because the structure you were leaning on just revealed itself to be made of wood, not stone, and wood can break, and if wood can break, then you need to learn to stand on your own." That night, lying in bed, staring at a ceiling he'd stared at 1,000 times before, the observer began the slow, painful, necessary process of dismantling the architecture of invincibility he'd built around Bruce Lee. Not because Bruce deserved less admiration. Bruce deserved more. But the admiration had to change shape. It had to grow from the blind faith of a disciple into the open-eyed respect of a peer. Or something approaching a peer. Or at least someone who understood that peering was possible. He was not angry at Bruce for being human. He was angry at himself for needing Bruce to be something else. And that anger, turned inward, examined honestly, metabolized slowly over days and weeks and months, became the most valuable thing he ever learned in that training space. More valuable than any technique. More valuable than any combination or principle or drill. The lesson was not about fighting. The lesson was about the danger of certainty. The absolute, corrosive, blinding danger of being sure. 4 minutes of sparring had not diminished Bruce Lee. 4 minutes of sparring had diminished the observer's need to make Bruce Lee into something no human being can be. And in that diminishment was freedom. Bruce, meanwhile, said nothing. The observer watched Bruce shake hands with the nameless man, watched him exchange those final inaudible words, watched him stand in the middle of the training space for a moment after the man left, and then watched him walk to his car. No expression. No commentary. No reaction that could be read from the outside. Bruce drove home, and the observer didn't hear from him for 3 days. I've spoken to people who were close to Bruce during this period, and the picture they paint of those 3 days is one of the strangest portraits of genius I've ever encountered. It's strange because it's so quiet. No dramatic outbursts. No throwing things. No visible crisis. Just a man lying on his living room floor with paper and pencils, thinking. Day 1. Bruce didn't teach. Didn't train. Didn't return phone calls. Linda found him on the floor of the living room, surrounded by sheets of paper covered in drawings. Not technique drawings, not the kind of diagrams you'd find in a martial arts manual. These were pattern drawings. Or rather, anti-pattern drawings. Shapes that tried to capture shapelessness. Lines that tried to describe the absence of lines. He was trying to map something that had no map, trying to pin down the quality he'd encountered in that nameless man's movement, the quality that had made his reading fail. Imagine trying to draw water. Not a river, not a wave, not a droplet. Water itself. The essence of water, the thing that makes water water, the quality of having no fixed form while always being entirely itself. That's what Bruce was attempting on his living room floor with a pencil and a stack of paper. And he was failing. Every diagram he drew imposed structure, and the thing he was trying to capture was the absence of structure. Every line he drew was a lie, because lines have direction, and direction implies pattern, and pattern was exactly what this man didn't have. Day 2. More paper. More drawings. He filled an entire notebook, according to Linda. Filled it front to back, both sides of every page. Then tore the pages out, stacked them on the floor, stared at them for what Linda described as an uncomfortably long time, and started over with a fresh notebook. The first notebook's pages went into a pile that grew throughout the day, a small mountain of failed attempts to give language to something that existed beyond language. I've read Bruce's notes from this period. Or rather, I've read photographs of notes that were shared with me by someone who prefers not to be named, a recurring theme in this story, as if the nameless man's anonymity were contagious. The handwriting in these notes changes between the early pages and the later pages. The early pages are meticulous, organized, precise. The characters are neat, the spacing is even, the diagrams are labeled and orderly. These are the notes of a man who believes the answer is close, who believes that the right arrangement of words and lines will capture the thing he's chasing. The later pages are different. The handwriting becomes jagged, uneven, overlapping. Words are crossed out and rewritten. Diagrams start in one direction and veer off in another. Arrows point to things that aren't there, as if Bruce drew the destination before he drew the path and then couldn't find the path. These are the notes of a man arguing with himself at 3 a.m, which, based on what Linda described, is exactly what they are. Bruce didn't sleep those nights. He lay on the floor and he drew and he thought and he failed and he drew again and he failed again, and the pile of discarded pages grew, and the answer didn't come. Day 3. 6 a.m. Bruce called Dan Inosanto. I figured it out. 3 words. After 3 days of silence and 2 notebooks of failure and a pile of torn pages on a living room floor. 3 words that, depending on how much weight you're willing to place on a single phone call, changed the trajectory of martial arts philosophy. What he figured out was this. And I want to state it plainly, because Bruce's own articulation of it would later become so famous, so quoted, so repeated and diluted and printed on t-shirts and tattooed on forearms that the original insight has been buried under layers of cultural sediment. The problem was specific. You cannot read what has no form. You cannot predict what has no pattern. If an opponent has no style, no rhythm, no habits, your ability to read them is useless. Your greatest weapon, the weapon that has won every encounter, the weapon that has made you the most feared martial artist on the planet, is neutralized. Not by strength. Not by speed. Not by technique. By absence. By the void where a pattern should be and isn't. The solution was equally specific. Become formless yourself. Don't have a style. Don't have a rhythm. Don't have habits. If reading is the weapon, then being unreadable is the armor. And the only way to be unreadable is to have nothing to read. No fixed positions. No preferred techniques. No default responses. Every movement is the first movement. Every reaction is born in the moment of its necessity and dies immediately after. Nothing is stored. Nothing is repeated. Nothing is predictable because nothing is predecided. Be water, my friend. You've heard it 1,000 times. You've seen it on posters and in documentaries and in motivational videos set to soft piano music. And every time you've heard it, it has sounded like philosophy. Like poetry. Like the kind of beautiful, abstract wisdom that sounds good in a quote but means nothing in a fight. It's not philosophy. It's engineering. It's the answer to a specific question, posed by a specific man, in a specific room, during a specific 4 minutes on an afternoon in the mid-1960s. The question was, what do you do when you can't read your opponent? And the answer was, you become the thing that can't be read. Every great idea has a birth story. Not the polished origin that gets told in interviews and printed in biographies, but the real one. The messy one. The one that involves a man lying on a living room floor at 3 a.m, surrounded by torn paper, failing repeatedly, sleeping not at all, until something clicks. Be water didn't come from meditation. It didn't come from reading Lao Tzu, although Bruce read Lao Tzu, and the resonance was real. It didn't come from some mountaintop revelation or mystical experience. It came from a sparring session that lasted 4 minutes against a man whose name nobody knows, in which Bruce Lee discovered, for the first time in his adult life, what it felt like to face someone he couldn't decode. That's not a diminishment of the idea. That's an elevation of it. Ideas that are born from real problems are stronger than ideas born from abstract contemplation. They have roots in the ground. They have weight. They work, because they were designed to work, not to sound beautiful. Bruce began restructuring Jeet Kune Do. Not immediately, not in a single dramatic overhaul, but steadily, methodically, with the quiet intensity of a man who has seen the flaw in his own creation and cannot rest until it's corrected. Before that sparring session, JKD had patterns. Revolutionary patterns, efficient patterns, patterns that were years ahead of anything else in the martial arts world, but patterns nonetheless. A trained observer, given enough time and enough exposure, could eventually learn to read them. Could learn the preferred angles, the default combinations, the rhythmic tendencies that even Bruce, for all his genius, defaulted to under pressure. The system was brilliant. But it was a system. And systems, by definition, are readable. After those 3 days on the living room floor, JKD began to shed its skin. Bruce started stripping away the patterns he himself had built. Removing the default combinations. Disrupting the rhythmic tendencies. Introducing randomness not as a flaw but as a feature. Every movement is the first movement. No technique is privileged over any other. No response is automatic. The body becomes water, not because water is gentle or spiritual or symbolically appealing, but because water has no fixed shape, and a thing with no fixed shape cannot be predicted, and a thing that cannot be predicted cannot be read, and a thing that cannot be read cannot be defeated by reading. This is the transition point. The hinge. Before that afternoon, Bruce Lee was the greatest martial arts technician who had ever lived. After that afternoon, he began the transformation into something else entirely. A martial arts philosopher. Not philosopher in the soft, academic sense. Philosopher in the engineering sense. A man who had moved beyond asking how do I do this technique better to asking what is the nature of technique itself, and is there something beyond it, and what does it look like, and can I become it? The observer didn't witness the 3 days. He wasn't in Bruce's living room. He didn't see the notebooks or the torn pages or the sleepless hours. He learned about them later, secondhand, through fragments shared by people who were closer to Bruce's domestic life than he was. But when he returned to training, he saw the result. Bruce moved differently. Not faster. Not slower. Not more powerful or more efficient or more anything that could be measured on a scale the observer already possessed. Differently. As if the man who had left the training space 3 days ago had been replaced by a man who looked identical but operated on different software. The techniques were recognizable, some of them, but the way they were assembled had changed. There was no sequence anymore. No A leads to B leads to C. There was only the moment, and whatever the moment required, delivered without precedent and without repetition. The observer said it was like watching someone speak a language that had no grammar. Every sentence was correct, every word was precise, but the rules that connected them were invisible, maybe non-existent. You couldn't learn the language by listening to it, because the language reinvented itself with every utterance. You could only stand there and experience it and know, with a certainty that bordered on religious, that you were witnessing something that hadn't existed before and might never be fully replicated. 4 minutes. That's all it took. Not 4 minutes of defeat. Not 4 minutes of humiliation or crisis or dramatic confrontation. 4 minutes of equilibrium. 4 minutes in which the greatest reader of human movement met the one text he couldn't read, and instead of breaking, instead of retreating, instead of rationalizing or denying, he went home and lay on his floor and reinvented himself from the inside out. I think about that sometimes. The arithmetic of it. 6 seconds to dismantle a karate black belt. 15 seconds to neutralize a college wrestler. 20 seconds to end a boxer. And 4 minutes of draw, of stalemate, of mutual incomprehension, to revolutionize an entire philosophy of human movement. The fast victories taught Bruce nothing. The fights he won instantly confirmed what he already knew and added nothing to his understanding. It was the fight he didn't win, the fight nobody won, the 4 minutes of unreadability, that cracked the shell and let the new thing in. There's a lesson in that, but I promised I wouldn't lecture, so I'll just leave it where it is. The nameless man left Los Angeles. When exactly, nobody is sure. Sometime after the sparring session, days or weeks or maybe a month, he collected whatever he'd brought with him, which by all accounts wasn't much, and he went. No forwarding address. No phone number. No school, no students, no legacy that anyone can trace. He didn't write a book. He didn't open a dojo. He didn't give interviews or appear at tournaments or do any of the things that martial artists of his caliber typically do to convert their skill into something durable in public. He just left. The observer tried to find him. Not immediately, but later, once the full weight of what he'd witnessed had settled into his bones and he realized that the afternoon in that training space was going to be the defining moment of his martial arts life. He asked around. Followed leads. Called people in Manila, in Bangkok, in cities he'd never visited and couldn't locate on a map without help. Every lead ended the same way. A shrug. A blank look. A polite "I don't know who you're talking about." The man had left no footprint. No record. No trace. He had passed through Los Angeles like weather, changing the atmosphere permanently but leaving no physical evidence of his presence. I looked too. Not as long, not as hard, and with the significant disadvantage of starting 50 years after the fact. But I looked. The trail is cold. Not cold like difficult to follow. Cold like never existed. Whatever underground fighting circuits this man came from, they are gone now, replaced by regulated combat sports and documented tournaments and fighters with Wikipedia pages and Instagram accounts. The world he came from has been paved over. And the men who inhabited it, the ones who survived it, are either dead or so deeply committed to anonymity that finding them would require a kind of investigative effort that I frankly cannot fund. The man is a ghost. Which, when you think about it, is exactly what you'd expect from someone whose entire existence was built on being unreadable. If your survival depends on leaving no pattern, then leaving no trace is just an extension of the same principle. You don't just become unreadable in a fight. You become unreadable in life. No fixed address. No fixed name. No fixed identity. Water doesn't leave fingerprints. The observer tried for years. Then decades. Then, at some point, he stopped trying, not because the desire faded but because the futility became too heavy to carry. He made peace with the not knowing. Or something close to peace. Something adjacent to it. He told me once, and this was late in our conversations, late enough that the formality had worn away and we were just two people talking about something that mattered to both of us. He told me, sometimes I think he wasn't real. Like he was a test that the universe sent Bruce. A problem designed specifically for him, delivered at exactly the right time. Bruce was getting comfortable. He was the best, and he knew it. And knowing you're the best is the first step toward being less than the best. That man, whoever he was, reminded Bruce that the universe always has someone you can't read. And that lesson was worth more than any victory. I don't believe in tests sent by the universe. I'm a researcher, not a mystic. But I understand why the observer frames it that way, because the timing is almost too perfect. Bruce Lee, at the height of his technical mastery, at the peak of his ability to read and dismantle any opponent, encounters the one person who cannot be read. Not a bigger person. Not a faster person. Not a more experienced or more talented person. Just a person shaped by an environment so brutal and so lawless that it burned away everything predictable and left only formlessness. A person who was, in a sense, the physical embodiment of the principle Bruce would spend the rest of his life articulating. The universe doesn't send tests. But sometimes the timing is so precise, so surgically appropriate, that you understand why people believe it does. The last time I spoke with the observer, he was 74 years old. We were sitting in a room in his home, a small room with photographs on the walls. Some of Bruce. Some of other martial artists, people he'd trained with over the decades, people whose names would mean nothing to most audiences but who represented, to him, an entire lifetime of movement and learning and bruises that healed and lessons that didn't fade. Some photographs were of family. Children, grandchildren, a wife who had died a few years earlier and whose absence was present in the room the way only a long-term absence can be, not as a whole but as a shape, a negative space that had become its own kind of presence. He was slower now. His hands, which had once been fast enough to impress Bruce Lee, rested on the arms of his chair with the deliberate stillness of a man who has learned to conserve motion. His eyes were clear, though. Sharp. The eyes of a man who had spent his entire life watching, reading, observing, and who had never quite stopped. I asked him, at the end, what he remembered most. Not from his training. Not from his career. From that afternoon. Those 4 minutes. He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that I thought he might not answer. Long enough that the silence in the room became its own third party, sitting between us, patient, unhurried, waiting. Then he said this. I've thought about that afternoon more than any other moment in my training. Not because of the fight. There was no fight. Because of Bruce's face. I'd watched that face for 2 years. I knew every expression it could make. The focus. The calm. The intensity. The humor. The impatience, because Bruce could be impatient, especially with people who wasted his time. I knew all of them. But that afternoon, I saw one I'd never seen. And I never saw it again. He paused. Looked at the photographs on his wall. Looked back at me. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It was fascination. Pure fascination. Like a child seeing something for the first time and wanting to understand it so badly that the wanting itself becomes a kind of joy. He wasn't upset that he couldn't read the man. He was thrilled. Thrilled that something in this world could still surprise him. Thrilled that there was still a problem he hadn't solved. Thrilled that the road ahead was longer than he'd thought. The observer leaned forward slightly. That's when I understood what made Bruce different from everyone else. Most people fear what they can't understand. They retreat from it. They build walls around it. They pretend it doesn't exist, or they attack it, or they run. Bruce fell in love with it. He met the unknown and he fell in love. He leaned back. Settled into his chair. The room was quiet. And that man, wherever he is, if he's still alive, he probably has no idea what he did. He probably thinks he just had a nice sparring session with a talented martial artist one afternoon in Los Angeles. He doesn't know that he broke something open. He doesn't know that the 4 minutes he spent on that floor, just moving the way he'd always moved, the only way he knew how to move, became the seed of an idea that changed the way the entire world thinks about martial arts. He smiled. Small. Private. 4 minutes. No winner. No loser. The most important fight in Bruce Lee's life. And the man who gave it to him doesn't have a name. The photographs on the wall caught the late afternoon light. Bruce, frozen in black and white, mid-motion, captured in a moment that had already passed decades ago. The nameless man, absent from every frame, present in every word. And the observer, sitting between them, the only bridge between a memory and a history. Growing older, growing quieter, holding the weight of an afternoon that nobody else will ever fully understand. He asked me not to use his name. After 50 years. He still asked. Some stories don't end. They just get quieter. And if you're patient enough to sit in the silence, sometimes the silence tells you more than the story ever could. 1 year after that sparring session, Bruce invented a technique specifically designed for fighters like the nameless man. Fighters who couldn't be read. Fighters who moved like water before Bruce ever used the word. And the first person he tested that technique on weighed 300 pounds. But that's another story. For another time. Most people fear what they can't understand. Bruce fell in love with it. And maybe that's the whole difference. Between good and great. Between mastery and genius. Between the fighter who wins every fight and the one who changes fighting forever. Not the ability to read every opponent. The willingness to be thrilled by the one you can't. This is the end of the story. And if I had to rate it on a 10-point scale for narrative depth, emotional resonance, and structural integrity, I'd give it a solid 9. The quietness is its strength. No villain, no spectacle, no knockout, just 2 men, 4 minutes, and a silence that changed everything. The only thing keeping it from a 10 is the ghost at its center, the nameless man whose absence makes the story both more beautiful and slightly less verifiable. But maybe that's the point. Maybe a story about unreadability should itself resist being fully read.